All right, I'm afraid it looks like the slow connection is back. I tried it, I waited, but I could not overcome it. So I think this section is another section where we unfortunately do not have any type of subtitles unless it changes in the next minute or so. Nevertheless, let's talk about chapter 4 and techniques to change meaning making. So far we talked about wise interventions that aim to change meaning. We talked about why we think changing the meaning is such a good idea. Then we talked about the motivations we want to tap into in order to change meaning. And now we talk about 4 techniques that have been proven successful and somewhat rooted in social psychological research to change the meaning of the person or the situation or an interaction. So the first one is direct labeling. I think if you remember in your social psychology session on self and identity, the importance of identity, people, children, adolescents, and us are everyone is constantly on the search for some kind of label, some kind of identity. Who are we? How can I distinguish myself from others? And so you can see here the sorting hat quiz will tell you which Hogwarts house you truly belong. Quizzes like that, things that give ourselves a moment of identity, of meaning, are super popular. And that's in some ways something that direct labeling kind of builds upon. So there's this hunger, this appetite for meaning and identity, and you can basically sometimes just tell people that they should do something because that is who they are. So for instance, in one classic study, I think it's in I forgot to put the references in here, but this is 1975, I think Maya 1975. In that study, they have 3 groups. One group is a control condition, the other one is a persuasion condition. These are children in year 5, and the people, the interventionists, they're trying to convince them to litter less in their school, to throw less rubbish on the floors. And there's one condition that they call here persuasion, where they tell them to, or they try to convince them by telling them why it's a good idea that they litter less. So they're trying to persuade them actively. In what here it's called attribution condition, what happened is that the children were told that they should litter less because they're litter conscious people. It is because of who they are. And I think they should litter less. That's what they tell them, because this is in line with their identity. They call this here, as you can see, attribution, because they should kind of have an internal source of attribution for their behavior that is their own identity. I am a litter conscious person. And what you can see here, this is basically how much litter they threw into the basket, the more the merry. And you can see that in the pretest they were all the same, all 3 conditions were the same, but then it popped up and it stayed relatively influential, that treatment, whereas persuasion and control basically did not have much of an effect in the post-testing. So what you can see here, that often if I change something within you, if I tell you not only that you're a Gryffindor, but also that you're litter conscious and a certain age, it's often assumed to work better for children, that has a real profound impact, and I will act like that. So for instance, my wife and I often use that when we describe our family to our children. For instance, we say that we are a family that's kind to others, in order to strengthen the idea in our children that this is part of our identity and this is how they should behave to others. So that is one way to use that. There's another, let me just quickly erase that these things. There's so far we talked about basically I'm telling you who you are, or BuzzFeed is telling you who you are in order to change your behavior. There's also a study, famous study by Lieberman and colleagues, I think it's 2004, and here what they do is they label a game differently. So they give direct labels either as the Wall Street game or as a community game. This is a game, a prisoner dilemma, that can test cooperation. So the more higher the numbers here, easier the more people cooperated on a y-axis. And here you can see on the x-axis that people who thought this is a community game cooperated much more than people were told in the Wall Street game. So here it seems that simply labeling a situation as either community-oriented or financial profit-oriented really profoundly changed the behavior people have, even though the incentives they can gain from not cooperating or cooperating did not change. So direct labeling for people or situation works well. It's not always easy to do, and it's thought to be more effective for children than for grown-ups. So the first technique is direct labeling, where you tell somebody who what the situation is or who they are. Another one is prompting new meanings. Here you can see a picture of this lovely influencer who is going to tell us how to clean your room. But the idea behind here is why I put that up is not that it's ridiculous that we need a person to tell us how to clean our room. No, that often we feel, and kind of use that for ourselves, that if we want to change the meaning of ourselves, if we want to change the meaning a little bit of our surroundings, one thing we can do is we can actually clean our room. And this is one technique that is on a larger scale often used, especially in the US, where it's called the no broken windows, where police and the community, in order to fight crime, in order to fight vandalism, fix all broken windows. So there's this idea there that if there's no broken window, people will not vandalize. But if there's a little bit graffiti, and if there's a little bit of for instance, rubbish on the floor, or there's a little bit of like one or two broken windows, then this tells me that this is an environment where vandalism is not that bad and not that frowned upon. So by changing the environment, you can change the meaning you make about this, how to behave in this environment, right? Here you see it's often more used in prompting new meanings by kind of giving leading questions to participants. So this is a study published in Science where they try to increase the interest people or students, young children with low expectations. So the interesting condition here is they want to students who are not very good based on their past experience to increase the interest and the grades in science. I think it was a chemistry lessons. They tested them. And what they did is, in one condition, which is here called the relevance condition, they asked them why they think this stuff is so important to their life. If they could name some reasons why this is so relevant to their own lives. So what they gave them is very leading questions. And now these children had to argue. So they pull out these meanings of themselves in a very leading way, right? It's like, tell me why you are so awesome would be an extreme case of that. But you can see in this case, at least, it is successful. So here you can see that the low expectation children were basically the most interested in a relevance condition in chemistry, and they also increased significantly their grades. And it seems like it's not statistically significant. You can see the error bars overlap, but at least they are as good as the high expectation kids. So here you give somebody leading questions in order to make meaning out of it. So you could also think a little bit about the intervention we talked about with the women who had low self-esteem were to recall compliments of their partner, and then you would ask them, tell us why this indicates how much your partner cares about you, right? Very leading question, and now you have to generate this meaning. This technique, prompting new meanings, is often used. It's very powerful, and especially when you combine it with the next one, which is kind of like a classic in social psychology, and that is increasing commitment through action, right? Here you can see, or you probably remember that from your good old days in social psychology, Festinger's famous cognitive dissonance experiment. And you remember they asked people in the high cognitive dissonance condition to tell the next participant for very little money that the experiment, which was insanely boring, is actually quite interesting. So they tell that the other participants, and by telling that, they start to believe it, right? This is often called the saying is believing technique. Or effect. So if you say something to other people, then this becomes really influential and you start believing into it. Just here as the classic cognitive dissonance. And it's a technique that is often used a lot, right? Where you basically ask people, if you want to convince them of something, then you ask them to convince somebody else of something. So I think here Cialdini in his wonderful book Influence, probably the best non-fictional kind of popular social psychology book, highly recommended by Bob Cialdini or Robert Cialdini. And he writes about how in the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese kind of used that in order to loosen the commitment of prisoners of war to America. So what they would do is they would say, like, okay, they would find something where Americans felt a little bit uneasy about their own government. Maybe some actions, some bombings, some attacks. And then they said, like, why can't you just write that down? This is something that's perfectly fine. You don't believe that this was a good act. So they would write it down. They would ask, why can't you read that out? We wanted you to read that out to your other comrades. And now the process has started, and they kind of, by saying is believing, started to basically their identity and attachment to the US became loosened, and they kind of fell for that trap. So it's very psychologically very clever to do that. So increasing commitment through action, right? It's also something, if you remember what I used in my intervention, where I asked the students of who just started, who just saw this belonging information package, to tell other students how they will use it. Or you can do this for year one students to tell them, how did you overcome your struggles? How did you find a way to belong after they learned this information? So now you're basically telling them to advise other students, and by giving this advice, they become much more committed to these actions, their own actions that they just identified. Again, it's crucial here, right? You're not telling people which techniques to use or what to do. You're basically just telling them to tell somebody else that this is a good idea. And by doing so, they get committed to it. The last one, so the fourth action, is active reflection exercises. Here you see James Pennebaker, one of the most influential psychologists, I think, outside psychology, if it's fair to say, of the last 50 years. And you probably heard of him. He has a technique which is called expressive writing. You might have heard of it, or you might hear about it in health psychology, in clinical psychology, a very powerful and easy technique. So what he does, and he does that most often with college students, but also with other people who have experienced some trauma, to write about it for 5 days in a row. So let's say I have a traumatic experience. What could we take? I don't know. My internet crashed while giving a huge online lecture. And now this is very traumatic for me. And now I write about this again and again and again. I think it's 3 or 5 days. Sorry, I can't remember. And the only advice is basically to write about it. And what emerges in these, when you look back at this, is that the first, the second, the third time, there's some narrative, some meaning emerges from this trauma for the people who write about this. And remember, the only thing he tells them, he's not telling them, oh, try to look at the positive side or try to make any meaning out of it. The only thing is, like, he says, like, just write whatever comes to your mind. Don't worry about grammar and expressions and typos and any of that. Just write whatever comes to your mind. This is only for you. And they do that. And he finds immense cognitive or mental psychological effects on well-being, but also physical. He finds that the physical health of the people who do that dramatically improves. Really powerful stuff. Less powerful, yet also interesting, is research I have done, which is also mentioned in that article on on basically changing the way with active reflective exercises. In our research, what I did for my PhD, we would like participants often to think about a desired future, something they would like to achieve, and kind of let their mind go and think think about it. So for instance, I could think about what is a silly thing I would like to achieve. I would love to be able to do 20 pull-ups. Okay, can't do it, not even close, but it's like, oh, if I could 20 pull-ups, I would be so strong, I would feel so cool, and I would have kind of like these fantasies of being in a gym and doing 20 pull-ups, and everyone around me would look at me in awe. Probably not, but just that's the fantasy. That's what we are trying to prompt in people. And then we say like, okay, what stands in the way? What is the thing that holds you back? And then people have to reflect basically on an aspect of their reality, of an obstacle that stands in the way. And by doing so, thereafter, you can see that it kind of changes the way they perceive that aspect, that standing in the way aspect of reality. It becomes a real obstacle, and people perceive it very differently. They have very different emotional responses to that. By this kind of guided reflective exercise, by contrasting in your mind like a desired future and obstacles stand in the way, you can have powerful effects not only on the way people perceive or attach meaning to their reality, but also on their commitment to take actions and their actions. Okay.